What does it look like when an aircraft carrier, struck by bombs that should have sent it to the bottom of the Pacific, catches fire so completely that the flames set off its own bombs, its own rockets, and its own fuel stores in a chain reaction that burns for the better part of 8 hours? What do you do when more than 800 of your own crew are already dead or dying? The ship is listing so badly that men are sliding off the deck into the ocean, and every officer around you is talking about the order to abandon ship. And what happens when 700 men, many of them wounded, choose to stay aboard anyway, fighting fires with nothing but hoses and their bare hands, because they have decided this particular ship is not going to sink? On the morning of March 19th, 1945, 70 miles off the coast of Japan, that decision kept the USS Franklin afloat. We'll show you exactly what those 8 hours looked like in a moment. First, you need to understand exactly how close this ship came to disappearing entirely and why almost nobody who witnessed it expected her to survive. They called her Big Ben. By the end of that day, the men who served on her had earned her a second name, the ship that wouldn't die. The threat by March of 1945, the USS Franklin, an Essex-class aircraft carrier commissioned barely a year earlier, had already survived one kamikaze strike off the Philippines the previous October, an attack that killed 56 of her crew and forced months of repairs at the Puget Sound Navy Yard. She returned to the Pacific Fleet in February 1945 and joined Task Force 58, Admiral Mark Mitcher's fast carrier striking force, for a series of unprecedented raids directly against airfields and industrial targets on the Japanese home islands, operations intended to cripple Japanese air power before the invasion of Okinawa. On the morning of March 19th, Franklin had positioned herself closer to the Japanese mainland than any American carrier had yet operated during the entire war, just 70 miles off the coast of Honshu, launching strike after strike against targets at Cobb Harbor. The ship's crew had already been called to battle stations 12 separate times in the 6 hours between midnight and dawn that morning, a grinding pace of alerts that reflected just how contested the airspace over the task force had become as American carriers pressed closer to the Japanese homeland than ever before. At 0708, while Franklin was preparing to launch her second strike wave of the morning, a single Japanese aircraft slipped through cloud cover that had concealed it from both visual observers and radar, dropping 2 550-pound semi-armor-piercing bombs directly onto the carrier's flight deck. One bomb struck near the ship's island structure, punching through to the hangar deck below, where 22 aircraft sat waiting, 16 of them fueled, and 5 already armed with bombs and rockets for the next strike. The second bomb hit further aft, tearing through multiple decks and igniting the fuel tanks of 31 additional aircraft warming up for takeoff on the flight deck above. Franklin's position at the time of the attack made the danger she faced especially acute in a way that extended beyond the immediate damage from the 2 bombs themselves. Task Force 58 had pushed its carriers closer to the Japanese home islands than American naval power had operated at any previous point in the entire Pacific War, a calculated risk that traded increased exposure to shore-based Japanese aircraft for the ability to strike directly at industrial and military targets the enemy had assumed were safely beyond reach. That proximity meant any American carrier damaged badly enough to lose maneuverability or speed became an unusually tempting and unusually reachable target for additional Japanese air attacks, adding a layer of urgency to Franklin's situation that a similar attack occurring further from the Japanese coast would not have carried to nearly the same degree. Every hour Franklin remained burning, listing, and vulnerable that close to enemy shores was an hour during which a follow-up strike, potentially finishing what the first attack had started, remained a genuine and immediate possibility. The secret development: there was no secret weapon that saved the USS Franklin that morning. What there was, instead, was a chain of individual decisions made by exhausted, terrified men in the middle of the worst few hours of their lives. Decisions that, added together, kept a burning, nearly abandoned warship from sinking. The initial explosions triggered a catastrophic secondary chain reaction that overwhelmed the ship's crew almost immediately. Fueled aircraft on the hangar deck erupted into flame, and the fire quickly reached armed bombs and rockets loaded on aircraft across both the hangar and flight decks, setting off a sustained series of explosions that continued for hours, each new detonation spreading the fire further and killing or wounding more of the crew fighting to contain it. Captain Leslie Jayers, Franklin's commanding officer, later acknowledged that the ship had not been at general quarters, full battle readiness, at the moment the bombs struck, a detail that would become the subject of extended post-war controversy and debate about whether faster initial response might have reduced the scale of the disaster that followed. Whatever the merits of that later criticism, what mattered in the moment was that the fire, once it took hold, spread with a speed and intensity that quickly overwhelmed the ship's normal damage control procedures entirely. As the fires raged and the ship began listing dangerously to starboard, threatening to capsize entirely, some crew members were ordered or chose to abandon ship, jumping or being blown into the ocean by the ongoing explosions, while nearby vessels, including the light cruiser USS Santa Fe, maneuvered dangerously close alongside the burning carrier to pull survivors from the water and, in a remarkable additional act of courage, to take on wounded crewmen directly from Franklin's deck while the fires still burned. But a substantial core of the crew, roughly 710 officers and men according to the ship's own post-war accounting, made the opposite choice, remaining aboard voluntarily even as the ship listed, burned, and continued exploding around them, working to fight the fires and save their ship rather than abandon her to the flames. The maneuver executed by Santa Fe's captain deserves particular attention on its own terms, because bringing a warship directly alongside another vessel that is actively exploding represents an extraordinary risk in itself, one that ran directly counter to standard naval doctrine calling for ships to maintain distance from a burning vessel whose magazines could detonate at any moment. Santa Fe's crew nonetheless held their position close against Franklin's hull for an extended period, passing hoses, taking aboard the wounded, and providing exactly the kind of sustained, close-range support that made the difference between an isolated, doomed ship and a crew that knew, even in their worst hour, that help had not abandoned them. That decision, made by an entirely separate crew aboard an entirely separate ship, represents its own quiet example of the same willingness to accept extraordinary risk on behalf of others that defined Franklin's own crew's decision to remain aboard. Technical supremacy. There is no chapter in this story about superior American damage control technology, because the men who saved the USS Franklin did it with fire hoses, manual valves, hand tools, and raw physical endurance, fighting a fire that modern damage control doctrine would recognize as catastrophic almost from the moment it began. Lieutenant Commander Joseph T. O'Callahan, one of the ship's Catholic chaplains, moved repeatedly through the burning ship, administering last rites to the dying, organizing firefighting parties, and personally leading men in flooding a magazine that threatened to explode and tear the ship apart entirely. Actions that would earn him the Medal of Honor, becoming the first chaplain in American naval history to receive the nation's highest award for valor. Lieutenant Junior Grade Donald Gary, a machinist's mate turned officer, discovered roughly 300 men trapped in a smoke-filled mess compartment with no apparent way out, and rather than simply reporting the danger, personally guided small groups of them, one at a time, through a maze of dark, debris-filled, smoke-choked passageways to safety, repeating that dangerous journey again and again until every trapped man had been let out, an action that would also earn him the Medal of Honor. Their actions represented the extreme end of a pattern repeated across the ship by hundreds of crew members that morning, individual sailors and officers making the deliberate choice to move toward the fire, and the trapped men rather than away from them, absorbing enormous personal risk in a fight that offered no guarantee the ship would survive regardless of what any individual did. For 8 continuous hours, the fires that had erupted from the initial bomb strikes continued burning and exploding across the ship, fed by aviation fuel, bombs, rockets, and ammunition that had been loaded and fueled for the morning's canceled second strike. Franklin's surviving crew fought that fire compartment by compartment, deck by deck, with equipment and techniques that offered no shortcuts and no guarantee of success, simply the accumulated, grinding effect of hundreds of exhausted men refusing to stop. The physical conditions those firefighting parties operated under are difficult to fully convey through casualty statistics alone. Compartments below deck filled with thick, choking smoke that made visibility nearly impossible even with battle lanterns, while intense heat from the ongoing fires warped steel decking and bulkheads, occasionally trapping men in spaces that had been passable minutes earlier. Ammunition and ordnance continued cooking off unpredictably throughout the ship for hours after the initial attack, meaning firefighting parties working to control one blaze had no reliable way to know whether a fresh explosion might erupt from an adjacent compartment at any moment. Sailors fighting fires on the flight deck itself worked in the open, exposed to the ongoing risk of further Japanese air attack, while men below decks fought in near-total darkness through smoke so thick that following a hose line by touch alone was often the only way to avoid becoming lost in a burning, disorienting maze of passageways that, under normal conditions, every man aboard would have known by heart. The global impact by the time the fires were finally brought under control, USS Franklin had suffered the loss of more than 800 crew members killed, with several hundred more wounded. Casualties that made March 19, 1945, one of the costliest single days in the history of the United States Navy for any ship that ultimately survived the attack that caused them. And yet survive she did. Franklin's surviving crew, without engine power for much of the ordeal and still listing dangerously, kept the ship afloat long enough for the light cruiser Pittsburgh to take her under tow, and eventually restored enough power to her own engines that she was able to make the extraordinary journey home entirely under her own steam, sailing more than 12,000 miles from the waters off Japan, through Pearl Harbor, through the Panama Canal, and finally to the New York Navy Yard, arriving in late April 1945 as, by most assessments, the most heavily damaged carrier of the entire war to survive and return home. The scale of Franklin's survival became, almost immediately, a source of genuine astonishment within the Navy and among the wider American public once the story became known. Naval historians studying the attack afterward would note that Franklin's casualty count from a single attack exceeded the combined losses of several other American carriers across their entire wartime service, a statistic that underscores just how close the ship came to a total loss that morning, and just how remarkable it was that enough of her crew remained aboard fighting to prevent that outcome entirely. The 2 Medal of Honor recipients from that single morning, along with numerous additional Navy crosses, Silver Stars, and Bronze Stars awarded to Franklin's crew, reflected an unusually dense concentration of individual valor even by the standards of a Pacific war that had already produced its share of costly, heroic single-ship engagements. The journey home itself, spanning more than 12,000 miles under conditions that would have justified being towed the entire distance, stands as its own remarkable technical and human achievement separate from the firefighting that preceded it. Franklin's engineering crews worked for days restoring enough of the ship's own propulsion to allow her to proceed under her own power rather than remaining dependent on Pittsburgh's tow line. A decision that reflected both practical necessity, freeing Pittsburgh for other duties, and a kind of stubborn institutional pride that mirrored the same refusal to accept defeat that had defined the firefighting effort itself. Passing through Pearl Harbor and the Panama Canal on her way to New York, Franklin's arrival at each stop became its own occasion for crowds of sailors and civilians to witness firsthand exactly how much damage a ship could sustain and still complete an ocean crossing under her own power, a traveling testament to the crew's achievement that reached far more people than any single official report ever could have. Conclusion: Franklin never returned to combat before the war's end, spending the remainder of the conflict undergoing repairs that would ultimately prove extensive enough that she was decommissioned rather than fully restored to active service in the post-war Navy. But the ship's survival and the extraordinary conduct of the men who refused to let her sink became one of the defining individual stories the Navy chose to publicize in the war's final months. A 1945 color documentary film, The Saga of the Franklin, was produced specifically to capture and preserve the crew's account of what they had accomplished. At a moment when the American public badly needed exactly this kind of story of survival against odds that had, by any reasonable measure, favored total loss. What Japanese pilots and commanders who monitored the attack's aftermath actually understood about Franklin's survival is difficult to reconstruct with precision from the available historical record, since the ship's return home occurred well outside any direct Japanese observation, and Japanese wartime accounts of the attack itself focused primarily on confirming a strike had been made rather than tracking the ship's subsequent fate. What the American record shows clearly, preserved in war damage reports, survivor testimony, and the ship's own after-action accounting, is a picture that needs no embellishment. A single Japanese aircraft, exploiting a gap in cloud cover and radar coverage, inflicted damage on the USS Franklin that any reasonable naval officer of the era would have expected to sink her within the hour. 710 men who chose to stay aboard a burning, exploding, listing ship rather than abandon her to the flames, made sure that expectation never came true.